Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today what we wanted to kind of unpack is the process that we go through when we're building a feature out in an app. So not like the whole app itself, like starting from, I have this vague idea for something, and now let's go to Xcode and start a new project. But as a product, as an app develops and gets better over time, you're going to inevitably have these little here's this feature I have, here's this thing that I want to do, and I want to add it in. And the way in which you go about that is something that requires a different kind of level of concern or planfulness than just starting from scratch. Because obviously, you're smushing it into an existing bit of code, and also just the constraints around what you're doing are different. And recently I ran into something where I thought it was an interesting kind of progression that I found that I was going through. And when I was adding a feature to Sleep++, which is my Apple Watch sleep tracker, basically I wanted to be able to, you record your night's activity and you end up with like a graph of how well you slept. And people asked, a feature I got many, many times was like, I want to be able to trim the night at the end of, it says if I wake up in the morning and I don't stop it right when I wake up, I wanted to say, actually, I woke up at this time. Seems a very reasonable feature. The thing that I found was interesting as I went through the process of building this out, and so it's like now it's basically a part of the app, is I tend to go I start off with that's an interesting idea. How would I build that? And then I tend to work a little bit, it's like from the bottom up and the top down when I'm working on a feature like this, which it seemed kind of funny. Like I start at the data level and start being like, well, what data would I need to record? How would I record that? What migrations do I need to do in my database? What changes will I have to make there? And I start building the basic structure for that on the bottom. And then I start at the top down in a really simplistic way. Like I start off with what's the UI going to look like, but I don't actually build that UI. I just take whatever stock control I can find. Like I think in this case, I took a UI slider, threw it into Interface Builder, I hooked it up to that, applied a transform to it because I needed it to slide vertically. So I just rotated it by 90 degrees. And that was my basic control. Eventually, I ended up replacing that with a whole custom UI and all kinds of things like that. But starting in that sort of top down, as simple as I can on the UI side, and then as robust as I can on the bottom side, is something that seems to work for me. And it's an approach, though, that I found that if I can't end up with something that I can use and can start playing with quickly, that's why the top down is important from just really basic, simple UI. I really struggle with actually getting things done. Do you have a similar experience?
For me, it any feature that I want to build, I always just build it as quickly as I can and start using it myself. And my process, like we talked a little bit about betas in previous episodes and everything. My process for testing out features is really, I just test them out myself for as long as I can before I show them to anybody else at all. Before I even send them to beta testers, usually. In Overcast, I mentioned last episode, I mentioned that that Voice Boost started out as having different levels. It was not just an on or an off switch. It actually had multiple modes. And I lived with that for months before I showed anybody else, before the beta started and everything. And I did a similar thing. I mean, my UI for controlling these things is mostly just stock UI kit. I very rarely make custom controls, or when I do, they're usually pretty lightweight subclasses of the built-in buttons and labels and sliders and stuff like that. Or they might just be a slight wrapper with one of those as a subview, and a few other labels here and there. But for the most part, I'm using mostly stock stuff because you can get really, really far with stock components in a UI kit, especially with all the custom appearance stuff that they've added in the last few OS versions. Really, I have found very little reason to really build out tons of custom control stuff, and I've instead focused on just skinning UI kit well. And so when I build these features, I mean, Voice Boost, as I mentioned, it used to have 4 levels. It used to be off, reduce, enhance, and boost. And I was about to launch with this. I really thought this was going to be what I launched with. And I had rationales for all of them. So the reduce mode would actually cut off. It was actually a high pass and a low pass filter. It would actually cut off big chunks of the top and bottom end for podcasts that were produced with flaws, with either way too much bass or sometimes podcasts would have like very high pitched noise, and so I thought a reduce mode would actually be useful. And then the volume boosting modes, I actually had two. I had enhance and boost, and it was just two different degrees of the same thing, really, of the EQ and the compression, and with boost being a much more aggressive compression setting. What I found in the beta was people were very confused by this because it just labeled dynamics, reduce, off, enhance, boost. It's like, okay, what does dynamics mean? It's just somebody who is not an audio engineer. Is that referring to motion? Like, what? It was a very confusing thing. People were confused as to why they would ever want to reduce the dynamics of something. And between enhance and boost, well, what does that mean? Is this like enhance like CSI, where you're uncovering detail that is magically there somehow? And it doesn't really communicate that enhance and boost are basically two different dynamics of the same thing. It was a very confusing feature. And I didn't, I mentioned last time, I didn't see the confusing aspect of it because I made it. And so I knew what it was. I didn't have to explain to myself what it was. My tester started seeing this and seeing that it was probably, not ideal. One day during testing, I just mocked up a quick little thing where I realized that I was just leaving it in boost most of the time, because after trying the other options here and there during development, I discovered that boost was just the best one. And that's where I wanted to leave almost everything. Like I almost never wanted any of the other options. So that's when I decided, you know what, I'll solve two problems. I'll solve the intuitiveness problem and the UI understandability problem with what this feature actually is. And, I don't actually want these other modes. In practice, I find out this isn't that important, so I'll cut those features. I'll make it one button. It's either boost, on, or off, and I called it voice boost, mostly because it was being next to smart speed, so it needed two words, because it would look weird if it only had one. This is how I make feature decisions.
It's important.
Yeah. And that's how that feature came to be. And I'll see if I can put a link in the show notes of. I always take screenshots along the way of designing the app. And so I have this whole history of like how the app looked in various stages of development and while prototyping various features. And so I actually have a screenshot of it with these four features, and I'll show you the effects pane with this, and then you can see like how the one I went with just the two big buttons was so much simpler. That's a very long-winded way of saying that I kind of evolve features as much as I can, both using it myself and then showing beta testers before they ever get to the public. And I think it's very important not only to have that process when adding features, but also to really consider, like, if I had released this the way I originally had it with these four different options, and then later decided what I decided during the beta, that this actually should really just be one thing, then that's a feature removal to a lot of people who use the other ones, and you got to go into that very carefully. And I'm not one to avoid feature removals. I have often angered people by removing features, but it is a lot harder to remove features politically after you've already shipped them to people. So I think one thing to also consider is, like, how do you remove a feature from an app, and how do you decide when to do that? When is the right time to do that? And how do you manage user expectations and user feelings about that?
Yeah, and I think it also speaks a little bit to one of the something that you have to get used to is that you are inevitably going to build features that won't ship, that you're going to build stuff that ultimately just doesn't work out. And I think there's a certain amount of just like distancing yourself from your work enough that you can look at it. Like, I've definitely gone down this path where I'm thinking, this would be an awesome new feature. And especially this is dangerous when it's a really interesting technical problem. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think I have this really cool solution to a problem. I go down the path and I start adding all these features, and it's like building it all out. And you get to the end and you're just like, it's a really interesting solution to a problem that people don't actually have, or it makes the gap really harder to understand, or more complicated, or less intuitive. And at the end, being able to say, like, I just need to throw this away. Like, that's a dead end. Like, that is just not going to go anywhere. And like, having done that now so many times, where I'll create this branch, go down it, and then end up deciding that this is actually not going to work, I'm just going to throw it away, is definitely an encouragement and a reminder to not spend too much time on things, in terms of trying to quickly get to a point that you can really evaluate how useful something is. because there's so many things that in my head sound like they'll be really cool and really fun, and when you implement them, like aren't actually as useful as you think. Or the more like good and bad situation is when you'll show it to somebody, and like you'll give them something to react to, and their response is like, "Huh, that's interesting. Why doesn't it just do this?" And they make it sort of like there's this like that clarifying simplification that you're just not seeing because you're deep down in the weeds of the coolness of the feature, or what, like on this particular track. And it turns out a much better solution is, it's like in this case with Voice Boost, it's like the dynamics and things I think these are really interesting and interesting options that you could kind of go down. But at the end, it's like really what people want is to make it louder so they can hear voices clearer. And so you just need on and off, and that's probably good enough. And you have to be willing to say, like, all that other stuff that I was doing, like the really sophisticated dynamic stuff, it's like, okay, maybe I just don't ship that because it's just going to make it more confusing rather than actually better for most people.
Right, because it was exactly the kind of thing where, like, it was technically interesting, it was technically impressive. Not a lot of podcast apps have enhanced dynamics and EQ controls and everything. So it was like a cool thing to do if I would have shipped that, because it was kind of like showing off my audio engine and my audio manipulation skills, I guess. But in reality, that was really just showing off for my benefit, and it was not like it was actually it would be making the app worse to ship it that way, because it was more confusing, because, as you said, like, not a lot of people really had that problem very often. Not even I had the problem often enough to use my own feature very much. So it really does take a lot of editing, and I feel like there's a good balance to be struck here between, like, the way I do it, I move pretty slowly, and, like, with streaming, like, I had streaming working to varying degrees of work, probably 3 months before I shipped it. But I wanted that very long testing period because I wanted to be very conservative with it and to have a lot of time just using it on my own phone before I even gave it to testers, let alone to the public. And on the other side, the other extreme of like the feature deployment speed here is like the kind of like continuous release paradigm, where you just kind of ship something out there as quickly as you possibly can, as soon as you have the idea for it, and see if it takes. Maybe do some A/B testing, or see what people's reactions are. I feel like the better balance is somewhere in the middle of those things. I feel like I move too slowly with the way I do things. But something like that, where you're constantly adding or removing things, first of all, it makes it harder to remove things. And second of all, I think you increase the annoyance rate of your users. Like when you do things, like when Twitter rolls out a new feature and it goes out to a random subset of people first, and everyone else hears about it and like, wait, why don't I have this? Or why is my timeline all of a sudden different? Or why does this not work the way I expect it to, and everyone else's works fine? These two extremes of like how often you ship things, how much testing you do internally versus just shipping to the public and seeing what they think first. There is a healthy balance to be struck between those two extremes. I haven't struck it, but I think I would rather be on the, if I'm going to be unbalanced in that way, I think I'd rather be unbalanced in the direction that I am, which is on the side of being too conservative and too slow, because ultimately I want my app to always have a reputation of being carefully considered.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, that the App Store itself is structured such that you can't do continuous release in a functional way, because your app always has to go through app review, which can take a non-deterministic amount of time, at least about a week. And so you have to be able to, you can only ship things to the store that you can live with for at least a week, probably. Which, depending on the kind of change that you're rolling out and the significance of it, or like if there's a problem with it, that you have to have a certain amount of conservatism to make sure that you're not putting something out there that is going to be very problematic for your product, that if for a week it's horribly broken or really confusing, like you can't just change that. Like continuous deployment and things works great for an app, like a web app or something that you can change in real time, or if you're in the Google Play Store, for example, you can do something like that a lot more there because you can roll out updates more quickly. But in general, it's definitely something that you have to be thoughtful about and understand that this is going to go out and you have no control over necessarily when someone's going to be able to change. And so, I mean, you can certainly go down the crazy roads where you have like A/B testing built into your app and it has multiple code paths and things, but that just seems like a nightmare to me. But it's definitely something that I think I'm more on the release things quicker approach. That like I tend to bite off nice small things, focus on them, get them like working, and then put it out there. And in general, I think that seems to work for me. And I think mostly some of that even is just an attention span thing. Like I really struggle to, like when I hear you talking about working on features for months, like that is really intimidating to me because I think I would lose interest. And once I got it, so like once I get something working, all the crazy edge cases are harder for me to have the discipline to track down. And so I tend to just focus and simplify the problem down to a point that, oh, look, all the edge cases seem to have sort of fallen off as best I can, which is a different kind of approach, but I found kind of works for me.
Well, I mean, that's probably the more healthy approach is, to ship something that is smaller but complete and ship that faster rather than wait until you have something that is complete but is big and sprawling and then that takes 6 months. I think your approach there is probably the healthier one.
Yeah, but it requires, I guess, and some of it too. Maybe it's the interesting thing of trying to decide. I'm just interested in a direction to shift the conversation to is how we decide what features to add. I think is a really it's a very complicated set of variables that I find that I'm balancing for these days, where on the one hand you have the desire to make something good, to ship a good product, to ship software that's useful, that people like. You have the constraint that you're trying to optimize for around like business model and business plan. Like, will adding this feature increase the number of people who are using my app or paying for my app or in some way contributing to the bottom line of my business? Is this feature something that's going to motivate me and make me interested? And trying to balance the sort of the tension between those is, I think, definitely more art than science, because there's not, at least I haven't found a good way to really know that other than just like, this feels right. Like every now and then I'll get asked by people, like how I plan releases. Like, how do I sit down? Like, not like I want to do like some kind of waterfall thing, but do I have like a big release plan? Like you probably need to have if you were trying to apply a team of developers onto something. And it's like, I tend to just sit down and look at my apps and be like, what could be made better? What would I enjoy building? And then think about, I suppose that might make people like the app more, and then go with it. But then you also, more often than not, I'll look at an app and be like, the app's kind of done. Like, maybe I should just leave it and work on, move on to the next app. And I guess that's why I end up with so many apps. But like trying to decide what feature is worth actually doing is really hard.
Deciding when an app is basically done or doesn't need massive attention for at least a little while, that is a skill that I think iOS developers need. And many of us, myself included, often don't do it right or don't have that skill because the economics of iOS are such that you really do have a much better chance of success if you have multiple apps. And the additional value that you will get, sales-wise or money-wise, the additional value you will get out of doing a big feature update to an existing app might not be worth the effort that it will require to be put into that to do. And a lot of people want the model of just having one app that they work on forever. Well, not forever, but one app that they pour tons of time into, polishing everything up, and being able to live off just that one app. And that is very rare to actually have that in the App Store and to be successful at that. Not because Apple is keeping us all down or anything, but because in most cases, most apps you hit a wall of diminishing returns where like most people's needs are satisfied by it who will find it and who will want it and who will pay for it. Most people's needs get satisfied pretty early on in development, and then you're just kind of like adding stuff just really for your benefit, trying to make the app better to boost sales or to get more press at some point or to get upgrade revenue maybe, whereas the customers really aren't in great need of those things. And the best example of that kind of thing is Microsoft Office. And you see like over time, all the challenges Microsoft faced over the last 20 years of like just trying to get people to buy Office upgrades, and when everyone's sitting around saying, you know what, Microsoft Word's been working fine for me. I don't really need anything else. Please don't add anything else, because every time I upgrade, I pay this large amount of money, and then everything gets slower, and some things are different, and I have to retrain myself or my staff. And so you have like customers who are actually kind of asking you, please don't upgrade this. So I feel like, if you take lessons from the industry in the past, you can kind of see like a lot of times, given limited resources, limited time that you have as an individual or as a small company, doing an upgrade to a product for the sake of upgrading it is not necessarily the best use of your time. And you, David, you have, I think, a very good sense of that, possibly even an overly aggressive sense of that, but I think it serves you very well in that you don't seem to pour a lot of effort into massive upgrades to apps that don't necessarily warrant them, and you are very happy to try new apps way more often than most people I know.
Yeah, and I think some of it is coming from understanding that. I remember a few years ago, I had the realization that the way we version number our apps, that is sort of in some ways somewhat like it's kind of arbitrary, that we tend to do this concept of like a major update, and then you have minor updates, and then you have bug fix updates. Like you have like 2.1.6 or something. And it's coming from a world where you made your money only on major updates. And so you had to kind of create this sense of, you put out a major update to get a bunch of money, and then you do minor updates in many ways to build goodwill, and bug fix updates just to fix things. But like you do these minor updates to build goodwill with your customers. They have this feeling of like they bought like this basic thing, and then, hey, they got this other stuff for free. Like they got all these minor updates, these other improvements for free. And then you come around and it's like, all right, now it's time to shake that tree, the money tree again, and and so like here's version 2. And you kind of, it's like, now it's like, all right, now all that goodwill I had, I'm kind of cashing it in and saying, please, please give me some money again. And you have to have some kind of feature or some kind of thing that you're able to point to and say, like, this is why you should pay me money now. But in the App Store, and at least in a lot of the way the App Store economics work, that isn't actually the reality anymore. That it isn't a situation where, like, most of my apps don't make any like when I do a major update, I see a little bump maybe in revenue, but overall it's really just about sustaining and maintaining a level of revenue in the long run. And that changes a lot, that mentality that like the version numbers of my apps are in some ways kind of arbitrary. Like they're almost more just marketing things. Like if I'm trying to get the attention of the press, then I may call it a bigger number. But I could also just call it version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, and it would be just as descriptive as far as my customers are concerned.
Yeah, I find the same thing with paid apps, especially where like, if the massive version number change is really good for press, but in sales, the sales can result from that press. You get a little sales bump sometimes, but I've always found that whenever I've done major updates to apps, this goes all the way back to Instapaper, certainly Overcast. Whenever I've done like significant feature updates or major like X.O updates, there is a bump, but it's a pretty small bump in sales, and every major version bump is smaller than the one that came before it. Yeah. And so you really are. I think you're right. It really is about maintenance. Like you are keeping the app up to date. You are keeping it competitive in a competitive field. You are keeping users interested. But I don't think any of those things require major X.O updates really ever necessarily. You can add like moderate scale features over time as they come and achieve most of that same goal. We are sponsored this week by Imagix. Imagix.com/UTR for Under the Radar. Imagix is basically an image CDN that they serve your images, but you can do operations on them. So you can resize them, you can translate their formats, you can scale and crop and twist and change the colors and do everything that you can add annotations to them. The number of operations you can do on these images simply by adding URL parameters and signing the URLs is incredible. I mean, you can resize them to any dimension, of course. You can crop, you can letterbox, any kind of resizing needs you have, they can do it. But you can also, as I said, you can do things like blur filters. You can do all sorts of special effects. You can adjust the colors, the toning. You can really do quite a bit with Imagix. I use it myself for Overcast, and I've been very impressed with it. It is very, very fast. Overall, I would say ImageX is really worth looking at if you need image manipulation, either for your app where you're serving, pulling images off the web, you need to do something with them into an app, or for web pages. It's especially nice for web pages because you can do things like serve responsive images, serve different resolutions to different browsers. There are lots of libraries if you want to use client libraries. They have lots of those, including one for Swift called Iris, which is from the developers over at Hodinkee. And if you look at Hodinkee is a watch website, like a watch enthusiast website, and they have beautiful imagery all over the site, and that's all powered by ImageX. So you can see a great example of all the things it can do there. Anyway, check it out today, imagix.com. That's imgix.com/UTR. Thanks a lot to ImageX for sponsoring our show.
All right. And I think in closing down this, one thing that I was trying to think through is like the concrete example of the best kind of features to add to an app. And the thought that came to mind is something that they'll talk about in video gaming when you're doing they'll be doing a patch or an update to an app or to the game, and they'll call them quality of life improvements, which are changes that don't change the fundamental nature of your app or of the game in this case, but are things that make using it better. Like it's just a quality of life thing. It makes doing this operation that used to be kind of annoying or complicated or awkward simple or more straightforward. And like that kind of quality of life update, when I'm looking at an app that I have and I'm trying to think of what are features I need to add, the first thing that I always try and think through, and I think it's a great place to start, is like, are there any quality of life improvements I can do? Is there some operation right now that is common and frequent, but awkward and annoying? And if I can find anything like that is by far the low-hanging fruit that I need to make sure that I'm taking care of before I worry too much about inventing new problems to solve. Like, are there existing problems that I have that the app solves, but solves in a way that I could make better? And if I do that, that's where I think you get the most bang for your buck. And that's where building features out and doing these little improvements that you can ultimately, you can over time make your app just better and better without making it more and more complicated or more sprawling.
All right. Thanks a lot for listening this week. Please recommend us on Overcast if you get a chance. Help spread the show. Tell a friend. We'd love to get more listeners to the show. And if you want to support our network and us at Relay FM, Relay FM just launched memberships recently. So you can pay money optionally to any Relay FM show or to all Relay FM shows. If you want to just give like a nice, basically monthly donation to us, we'd appreciate that if you feel like it. If not, no big deal. Thanks a lot to ImageX for sponsoring. And thank you all for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.